number of things when we go this quickly, but we're going to cover a number of significant events and then make some conclusions about things that we can learn from God's use of Martin Luther. So we're going to cover the Peasant War of 1524 and 1525. We're going to cover the Augsburg Confession, and then we're going to look at the Protestant Alliance that was called the League of Shmaldon. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. There's like another syllable that I can't figure out how to fit in there. And the Augsburg Interim. So this sounds really boring, but there actually is some helpful lessons for us. And I really find this period of history to be akin to our own period of history. So we're gonna go with it. Well, before we come to the Peasant Wars, it's necessary that we see that during this time, Luther also marries. It is a fantastic story. Who is familiar with how Catherine von Bora, as well as some other nuns, arrived in Wittenberg? That's right. You know what kind of barrels? No. Yeah, I know. That's does anybody, Tim, you know what kind? Fish. So that's a interesting aroma that you would have if you showed up. So they were smuggled out of a convent in fish barrels. So a fishmonger, which is just a fish salesman, took out these barrels. Presumptively they were fish, and in fact I think they were 6 nuns. Maybe the number is wrong, could have been 8. And then they arrive in these barrels in Wittenberg, and all of them but one is married off. And the one who is not is this lady, Catherine von Bora. Martin Luther called her Katie. And so they are married. It wasn't like love at first sight or anything like that. But they actually did have a very sweet marriage. God bless them, I believe, with it was like 6 children. They buried, I can't remember how many of them. So Luther's life was, in one sense, blessed by his marriage, but it also he had great pain from just the death of his children. But this also is, if we don't have time to look into it, but if caricatures of Luther that also ignore Luther as a father, it is an unfair presentation of the man Martin Luther. So he loved to teach the children, and his catechisms were what he felt was his most lasting contribution. Luther did say that he married Catherine von Bora to spite the Pope. Now, do you think a married man would ever say that and mean it to his wife? No, he would not. All right. So you can see the way Luther handled language, that if you married your wife to spite the Pope, your wife would not be complimented by that. So Luther would just talk that way just to sort of make his point with a great deal of force. But it's also during this time that the Peasant Wars of 1524 and 1525 emerge. Peasants' condition had been worsening in the latter part of the 15th century, in the early 16th century. Again, if you can imagine, I would imagine all of us here, I'm projecting that you are a descendant of some kind of peasant class. I sure am. And so your people, like my people, you would be born into working land dependent upon some lordly class to allow you to work their land so that you could have some form of meager sustenance. And so you are totally dependent upon the lords and what they gave to you, remunerated you for the care of their land. And so that was the structure at the time. And this was in a bit of turmoil, and for a number of reasons that the conditions were getting worse for peasants. And there had been a handful of revolts already at the latter part of the 15th century and early 16th century. But the Reformation doctrines made the Peasant Wars of 1524 and 1525 different. And that's because the peasants viewed Martin Luther and Martin Luther's doctrines, and these doctrines that were emerging. Wittenberg was the epicenter, but these doctrines to be biblical proof for the peasants' cause. And so they were different in degree and in motive from previous peasant uprisings. Again, if you imagine the Reformation to be only a spiritual, doctrinal reform of the church, then you have to neglect the whole context of the Reformation. The Reformation was significantly, political dynamics are at work. This is the precursor to a great deal of political upheaval in Europe, and these tremors are already starting during the time of the Reformation. And the Peasant Wars are a part of that. The Peasant Wars were cautioned. Luther told the peasants that they should not take up arms, sort of a political revolution by force. Luther told them that was not lawful. Luther did write things that excited them, like the way that Luther wrote, what Luther wrote. In one sense, they heard Luther's writing to be exciting their cause, but Luther never believed that the cause of Reformation in the church should take political force, should take military might. And so Luther was never condoning the political and sort of military revolution that the peasants eventually took up. When he cautioned them, they did not heed what he said, and then he in turn represented the peasants. They made 12 demands of the princes. These 12 demands are called the 12 Articles. One of the reasons I'm giving you this information is because right now there is at some level a similar air in our nation. And I would like for you to see that the more biblical minded men were not revolutionaries. Reformers were not revolutionaries. Now we'll see, in one sense, Zwingli dies in battle, but it wasn't necessarily because he was a revolutionary. There were revolutionaries at this time, but Luther was for a dialogue, that there would be a lawful way, that an agreement that would be just and reflective of biblical truth could be navigated even in these difficult circumstances. So Luther went to the princes and presented and considered the 12 articles that the peasants demanded that the princes give to them. They were economic as well as religious. Luther said that their demands were just. These are just demands that they give to you. But it broke down because the peasants took up arms against the princes. I think there is help there for us. All right. So in this particular time in our nation's history, I would want to make sure that Berean Community Church and those of Berean Community Church are communicating to our fellow Christians and maybe even our fellow citizens: do not act lawlessly. Do not participate in any kind of revolution. We should be seeking lawful means at first and foremost. And so Luther was doing this, but there were some other hotheads who prevailed. And the prophets from Zwickau are the ingredient. This one particular man with the last name Münster, who was a native of Zwickau. He had come to Wittenberg. He believed that God was giving direct revelations to him. And these revelations are superior to Scripture. And his view of the kingdom of God was that God was in the present, breaking in to the world with the literal, physical, political kingdom of God that required this kind of political, military, revolutionary action. This is Münster from Zwickau. Luther had zero toleration for this kind of thing. And so Luther ran him out of Wittenberg, but he went to join the peasants' uprising. This is another reason that I would like for us to understand historically a charismatic understanding of the gifts, the continuation of the gifts of prophecy or the gifts of tongues. It doesn't have a place in historic Protestantism. So I think our brethren like John Piper can make a case and they can argue from scripture why they think these things continue, but they clearly can't argue from reformational history that this was a part of the way the reformers in the Protestant church understood these gifts to operate. Luther was very opposed to the Zwickau prophets and pretty much anyone like this, which did include some folk in Zurich. It also included the Anabaptists. And so part of the thing that we may have to reckon with is Luther's passionate opposition to Anabaptists, such that he would even consider drowning them to be an acceptable punishment for their doctrines and their practices. That this is also, he associates them and their views of baptism with some among them, quite a few among them, who were like Münster. And so the other part of this that's, I think, a helpful lesson is when you consider things changing that are revolutionary, you should expect to go slow and for people to have significant resistance. Believer baptism was to Luther, it was to John Calvin, a revolutionary practice. It doesn't seem that way to us because it seems to, and they saw it too, it was very clear in the New Testament. But until America, there was no nation that had a place for the kind of freedom of religion that didn't require a religion to be the default setting of everyone born into that nation, every citizen in that nation. And so this notion that you would have this, this true spiritual church that didn't include all citizens, that was a revolutionary idea. So I think in part this passionate opposition to Anabaptists was because of their associations, at least some of them, their associations with people like Münster and the Zwickau prophets. And all of this is revolutionary activity to their mind. There is not an ounce of it that they could sort of tolerate as permissible. And so while Luther responds to the uprising of the peasants as that is unlawful, he also cautions the princes that they should retaliate with mercy. They do not listen to Luther. They retaliate without mercy. They slaughter children. They slaughter women. They kill. The records, the historical records that I have read, there's debate. It could have been 100,000. That seems to be the low number. Upper numbers are 500,000 peasants were slaughtered. Now, this is going to be significant when you also take into consider what I think is some failures of Luther towards the end of his life and the end of his ministry. But could you imagine the peasants viewed Luther after the Peasants War that led to the slaughter of at least 100,000 peasants? They viewed that as Luther trading them, that Luther, he turned on them in that particular event. At the same time, could you imagine, even if you in your own conscience knew that you did not do that, yet there would be 100,000 men, women, and children slaughtered. And you were involved in this. Right? This is the kind of weight that Martin Luther had to deal with. It's also at this time that he is married, and Carl Trueman gives this general observation about the influence of Catherine von Boren as Luther's wife is that Luther is definitely like this. I mean, he is his highs are highs and his lows are lows. And she begins to sort of steady him out. And so that often tends to be one of the blessings of marriage, is that there can be, for men, if they were single and they did not have that sort of necessary steadying that a wife and domestic life provides, they would be more tumultuous in the way that they behave. And so Catherine von Bora has that beneficial effect to Luther, and does take Luther through some of the most difficult times of his life. So the peasants end up being slaughtered mercilessly by the princes. Now, the significant part of this is Luther now loses credibility with the peasants. That's significant as we're going to understand what ends up at the end of Luther's life and Lutheranism. Another consequence is the Catholic authorities, they blamed Lutheranism for the revolt. So now this reformational doctrine calling for the reform of the church is able to be considered, this is revolution. This is what your doctrine produces. And so Luther is losing on the Catholic opposition front. Luther is losing with the local German peasants. They think he has betrayed them. And the peasants went back to Catholicism, or they went forward into Anabaptism because of how they judged Luther's failure to stand with them. And so social and political forces at this particular period in Saxon Germany were now pushing everyone to take a side with Lutheranism, with Luther and his doctrines. This is another thing that we just need to realize, is that in moments like this in history, when there is like a pregnancy that is beginning to give birth, and there's these birth pangs, such that there is very much disruptions of societal order, there's these changes, you should expect that people are going to be pushing for you to take one side or the other. You just need to understand that this is the way people are going to push. They're going, are you with him or against him? Are you with this? Are you against this? And so the Catholics began to especially push on this preeminent Roman Catholic scholar and humanistic leader. We've already seen Erasmus, right? Because in one sense, he was the celebrity. And so Erasmus had previously had some respect for Martin Luther. He thought that Martin Luther was maybe a kindred spirit calling for reform in the church. So Erasmus really hadn't taken aim at Luther, but at this point, he now is really forced. You need to take sides, and you really need to take aim. And so this is what Erasmus does. It's interesting, though, and this is going to be very helpful for us as Protestants today, is when Erasmus was choosing, what was he going to oppose with Martin Luther? Because there's a lot of things that he could oppose. He was tackling the mass. He was tackling, the moral abuses of the church. There's even marriage. There's lots of things that he could have chosen, but Erasmus chose the doctrine of predestination, or to say it the other way, the doctrine of free will. And so Erasmus's choice is to write a short little treatise that is opposing Luther's doctrine of predestination, his doctrine of man. And so he wrote the diatribe on free will. And Luther responds to this with the book that I showed you last week, The Bondage of the Will. And I read to you some of his language towards Erasmus, just for you to get a little taste of what Luther was like. But in this book, The Bondage of the Will, Luther, as he was gifted to do, forcefully argued for the doctrine of predestination as biblical and necessary because salvation was all of grace. Salvation is the free gift of God. Luther leveled against Erasmus that the doctrine of free will as he presented it was a construct of pagan philosophy and humanist moralists. That's what Erasmus would be. Luther said that they failed to give human sinfulness its due place. And Luther taught instead that human beings are powerless against sin, which is within them and defines them and holds them bound. That's why Luther's book is called The Bondage of the Will. What is the will bound to? Sin. Erasmus' book, The Diatribe on Free Will. Luther's book, The Bondage. Do you get it? Like, that's just great. That's exactly how Luther goes. If you write a book called Free Will, I write a book called Bondage of the Will. And this is in one sense why Luther is incredibly effective. But we'll get to see, but he's not necessarily going to give you some mediating understanding for how it should be applied. Well, Luther, in the Bondage of the Will, forcefully presents what Paul, especially in the New Testament, but not just Paul, argues about, that sinners need divine intervention to bring about justification, that is, God declaring them to be righteous. Luther reestablishes what Augustine had written and explained before. So he argues from Scripture, he argues from the church fathers. And Luther says that indeed man has no freedom from sin's power, and that even a justified sinner is still a sinner. Human will is bound to sin unless God initiates and breaks them free on the basis of his grace. So the difference between Erasmus and Luther could not be more dramatic, because the difference between Erasmus and Luther, while they both were calling for reforms, the root of the reform is fundamentally different. Luther's call for reform is not at all the same species of reform that Erasmus was arguing for. If you believe that humans are not bound by their sinful nature, then you can believe that the kind of reform that is possible for a human being is a kind of moralistic reform to where God and man are cooperating to bring this about. If you believe, as Luther argued, that no, mankind is bound, his will is bound by sin, and divine interruption on the basis of grace is the only thing that can enable a sinful man to be declared righteous by God, and yet even then he remains a sinner still, then what you are calling for is a kind of reformation that can only be done by God as the gospel goes forward. And in that's the essence of Protestantism. In one sense, if you want to try to boil down Protestant, that's Protestant. Now, I would also argue that's just biblical faith. That is the same thing that in the Old Testament, the religion of Israel was ultimately aiming at this need that God alone can provide, and that indeed Israel needed, that he would provide when Messiah comes. And the New Testament unfolds. This is what God has done in the Messiah. So this is biblical religion. This is biblical faith. But in the context of the Protestant Reformation, this is the essence of Protestantism. This is why words like evangelical were the words to describe Luther and the kind of faith that he is presenting. This is why these kinds of words like evangelical continue to be historically connected with Protestants, because this is evangelical faith, Protestant faith, to where God, by divine initiation on the basis of his grace, absolutely interrupts the slave of sin and gives new life. Such by faith in Christ, he declares you to be what in fact you are not, righteous. And so in this sense, this is why we should get revved up to be Protestants. We should be happy in our heart to be able to say, yes, on this, which is the essence. Luther himself understood this is the essence of the Reformation that he was calling for. This is a world that separates him and Erasmus, that this is where we stand with Luther. He was right. Right. So at this point, there's a few things that also fall out. The emerging movement of humanism. Do you remember we've talked about humanism? Erasmus is this sort of key chief humanist. He's the rock star of the world. All right. Our humanism and Protestant Reformation, as it's going to eventually, be emerge as, they're not going to be able to cohere. So there was hopes that humanism, and if you go on to study, we're not going to do this, but like the way philosophies emerge, and it goes on to, in a number of different strains, people like to criticize and say, well, Protestantism is really the results of these emerging philosophies that really give human ability a very, very high ranking position. That's not true. Protestantism at this point is very clear. It is a fundamentally different species than humanism, and humanism and Protestantism are not going to be able to mix. Now, this is a disappointment to a number, especially Philip Melanchthon, and we'll see a consequence of this in part. We're not going to look at it in detail with Luther's death and Melanchthon's influence. But the consequence of Luther's bondage of the will in response to Erasmus' diatribe of the will is it sets out clearly the essence of the Reformation religion and the fundamental difference at heart with Erasmus's humanistic reform of the church. And there's not going to be a union between humanism and the Reformation. This was a great disappointment to Melanchthon, who was Luther's handpicked predecessor. Luther seems to have like this fatherly role and affection for Melanchthon, who was on all accounts an absolute genius. And we're going to make some points about this relationship and Luther's choice and Melanchthon's weaknesses as well. One of the consequences is, as Melanchthon has to take on roles of leadership, and they are quite significant, he's always going to try to walk a line between supporting Luther and maintaining relationships with Erasmus and humanists, right? And I think it's because Melanchthon, he did not see things as clearly as Luther saw things. I think part of it was because Melanchthon was educated as a humanist. That was his world, that was his aspiration, and Luther could give a rip for humanists. And so he did not in any way sort of desire to play the hand towards the humanists. So that's really significant just for us to understand what takes place. All right. So we've lost the support of the peasants. Catholics are saying that Lutheranism is bringing about a revolt. Clearly, humanism is not going to be able to have a place with the Reformation. And so now we get to a place where politics are beginning to shift and change. Charles V is the emperor. You may need to remember that Charles V, He has to be elected by this group of electors. Luther's protector, Frederick the Wise, is one of these electors. And so anyway, that's how the emperor finds himself in this position. Well, Charles V, the emperor, needs to make one's religious alliance in the German territories. He needs to make it known. Like, people need now to say, what is your religious alliance? Are you with the Lutherans or are you with the Roman Catholics? Austria and the southern German territories sided with Roman Catholicism, and the Lutheran provinces made a formal protest to this Austrian and southern German territories that were Roman Catholic, right? This is historically where the name Protestant comes from. Just in case you're ever wanting, someone says, why are you called Protestants? Right? One answer is because we protest the doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, to be fair, you'd have to say, well, it emerged because there was a protest against the doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church pre-Council of Trent. But it was also historically because of the Lutheran princes made an alliance of their provinces against Roman Catholic Austria and the southern provinces of Germany. So that's where Protestant comes from. Charles V now wants to call a meeting where they're going to argue these points. Now, I would just like to say, wouldn't that be sweet? Like, even if there was, so here's another thing. Like, it's really hard for us to understand, like, why would the state execute heretics? Like, that's a category that we as Americans do not have. Now, I'm glad they don't, so I'm not advocating for it, but just figuring out, like, how do they have that particular gear in their brain such that they would think that? And this is one of the reasons. At least they had the tradition. Maybe they actually fundamentally understood. Do you know what is the most powerful ingredient in any society? Religion. Like, what one believes to be true. So what then is a very serious enemy of the state, if that's true? False religion, falsehood. So we categorically tend to act as if religion and politics are like oil and water. And that's not true. They at least understood that you can't have a peaceful state when you have a religious war going on within your territories. So Charles V says, we need to figure this thing out. We're going to argue about it, which, that's, to be honest, that's the way it should be. Men should say, all right, we need to get together and have an argument about this. So he calls the Diet of Augsburg in 1530. He wanted an exposition of the points that were the dividing issues between the Lutheran provinces and the Roman Catholic provinces. Melanchthon is the main author of the confession that emerged in the Diet of Augsburg, and it's called the Augsburg Confession. So if you're looking for one of the oldest Protestant confessions that is written to deal with these issues, it is the Augsburg Confession. Now, what do you already know about Melanchthon? Well, at least he's sensitive to what? He's sensitive to humanists and humanism. All right. You're going to find out that Melanchthon is going to backpedal off the doctrine of predestination. He's not going to want to say it the way Luther says it. Melanchthon doesn't say anything the way Luther says it. But on the other hand, Melanchthon does have a degree of clarity. He can handle, maybe not clarity, he can handle things with a little more finer touch than Luther can. But Melanchthon is the author of the Augsburg Confession. And this became the document that Protestants got behind, and thus it was the united front of Protestant faith. So historically, that's pretty significant for us to understand. That's also, so here's another connection. What was required for Protestants to be united and have a united front in protest to the Roman Catholic territories? A confession of faith. A confession of faith. Right? This is another lesson for us to learn. Evangelicals, for whatever reason, have this resistance to confessions. They have a resistance to creeds. They are at best misguided, naive, maybe ignorant. At worst, they're rebels. They're foolish. They don't understand what the consequence is of saying, I have no confession but Christ. Right? So we do have, I think, a good example to realize for a united front that is able to communicate clearly what one believes. Confessions have been the way to communicate. This is what the Bible teaches on, and you have your points laid out. So this is what the Augsburg Confession is. So the princes of these Lutheran provinces, they signed the Augsburg Confession, which, do you know what this now functions as when they signed the Augsburg Confession? This is a political protest to Charles V. Charles V is a Catholic. Charles V views the Lutheran as a heresy. It needs to be squashed. And now you have these princes, they are signing the confession that it is a refusal to submit to Charles V. And so Charles V does not forget this. So there is this alliance of Protestants that is called the League of Shmaldon. The emperor, Charles V, now joins forces with Spanish troops in order to crush the Protestant Alliance in Germany. Now, when you're assessing it, if Charles V were able to take his troops and the Spanish troops and come against this League of Shmaldon, they would crush the Protestants. Right? This is not a contest. Right? So this is what the Protestants clearly understand is, right, like we're done. Like we can fight back, but you can definitely read the writing on the wall as we're going to get whooped. And so what this League of Shmaldon was, it was not only a religious alliance, it was also a political and military alliance to, in united front, fight back against Charles V and the Roman Catholic forces. Luther was asked to comment. Can the League of Shmaldon, can those princes from those provinces, can they lawfully before God take up arms and defend themselves against Charles V and the Spanish forces? This in some ways is an age-old question for us, isn't it? What is the right response of the church and Christians under God to deal with these invading, oppressive, yet at some level legitimate authorities? Luther takes his time in responding to this, not because he was doing other things. It was because of the significance of his response. He knew this is a big deal. And what does he also have not that long ago behind him? The Peasant War, the blood of at least 100,000 peasant men, women, and children. So he understands, like, this is clearly just not a game in the academic guild. So he takes his time and he responds, and he does conclude that the League of Shmaldon can lawfully take up arms in self-defense against the emperor. I just want you to see here that in one sense, at the beginning of the Protestant struggle to figure out how do we please God when there is no state that is for us, you're going to see what has emerged is called the place of the lesser magistrate to oppose acts of aggression, military aggression, right? That continues, and we are today citizens of a nation that was persuaded that that indeed is lawful in God's eyes. All right, but we see it at least in a seed form here. Guess what God does? While the two sides are preparing for war, there's a Turkish threat that emerges on the eastern front of Charles V's territory. And so now he has to do a few things. One, he realizes is he's going to need his military forces for the Turkish threat against Vienna, but he also is going to need the Protestants to be with him. So he now has to back down, and they go to sign a document to articulate this, and it's called the Peace of Nuremberg, signed in 1532, which was a document establishing peace between Catholics and Protestants within Germany, within this sort of Saxon Germany. The Protestants vowed that they would give military support with Charles V against the Turks. And they also said that the Protestant doctrines, the Augsburg Confession religion, would remain within the bounds of their territories. And so that is the arrangement. And so God, in his sovereignty, allows for political forces to favor the Protestant. All right, but just think, does the gospel do that? Does the gospel stay in territories? No. All right, so the gospel, the Protestant doctrine, the faith of the Augsburg Confession does not stay contained in the territories. And so it goes outside. These confessing Protestants continue, the faith extends into the other provinces. Now, I think you can see that Germany at this time is a complicated situation. There's distrust within those an emperor of the Emperor Charles V. The Catholic princes don't trust him. Obviously, the Protestant princes don't trust him. And so there's a lot of political reasons that Charles V is unable to stop the Protestant expansion, even though the Protestants aren't keeping, or at least the Protestant faith isn't keeping with the peace of Nuremberg. But he can't do anything because of these sort of political and social challenges that he faces. It's also true that Protestantism becomes a cover for political movements of political leaders. So Philip Hesse of Württemberg is one example. Philip professes to be a Protestant, and he is a part of the alliance, the League of Shmaldon. But Philip also is a reason that the League of Shmaldon, it also weakens. And this is going to be a disappointment, I anticipate, for you and Martin Luther, which this is good. We need to be disappointed with the things that should disappoint us about our heroes. Philip was married, but his marriage, we will say, did not have the kind of godly benefits that God designs marriage to have. I'll let you figure out what I'm referring to. And so Philip had taken up unlawful means of satisfying his desires. But as a confessing Protestant and having these Protestant theologians like Melanchthon, like Luther, like a man named Bucer, they knew this was not acceptable. And so he sought counsel for them. Well, one of the solutions to Philip's problem is, could he marry another woman? Now, what do you call a man who is married to two women? A bigamist. Philip was a bigamist. But the challenge is not only that Philip but became a bigamist, but that Luther, Melanchthon, and Bucer agreed that Scripture didn't prohibit bigamy. And so when they tried to keep this concealed, but when Philip of Hesse's bigamy became known, then obviously what did people think of this alliance of Protestant princes? This is a sham. And who also gets rolled into this sham? Oh, the prince gets 2 wives, Luther and Melanchthon and Bucer. And so this is one of the events that began to weaken the Protestant alliance. And here's what you need to understand. So this is the beginning of where, and you also know there's lots of political pressure. I mean, we have a war that is almost happened, but yet another war prevents the war between the Catholics invading the Protestant German territories from taking place. Right? Would you say things are stressful for Luther? Yes, these are stressful. All right. So now he has even the Protestant alliance falling apart and not being supported. Again, we just need to enter in at some level with understanding the challenging situation that Luther is in, because I think what we're going to see is Luther is going to make compromises. Right. So the bigamy of Philip of Hesse, approved by Luther, Melanchthon, and Bucer, is the first event that begins to take down the League of Shmaldon. The second is a man by the name of Duke Maurice. He is a confessing Protestant, but he refuses to sign the League of Shmaldon. He wants to insist upon his independence, and he takes Emperor Charles V's side against the League of Shmaldon. Now, the reason at one level is because it seems unlawful, and 2, he wants to remain independent of these alliances. But all of this, if we had time to get into it, Luther begins to backpedal a bit about the way that he had articulated things. Now, we're not going to go into the particulars. He doesn't in any way sort of yield on the doctrines of the Reformation, but the Luther that we saw, who seemed to stand against the world that was opposed to him alone, begins to compromise. So one of the things that I have come to church history, I've wanted to find heroes who do not compromise. I've wanted to find these individuals in the history of the church that you can look at your life and you see, there is a man who did not compromise. Now, I can remember the day in seminary when we covered Luther compromising towards the end of his life. And I can remember being just emotionally sad because Luther, he made some compromises. I think, one, that's a good thing for you and I to have, because ultimately Jesus Christ is the only man who never compromised, but perfectly obeyed the will of the Father all the time. Right? Luther, as great as he was just like us. Well, the third event that takes down this sort of stair-step drop of the Protestant alliances in 1546, Luther dies. Right? Luther dies. This is another helpful thing to understand. There's two practical lessons, I think. Number one, there is a need for a man to be upfront who can unite people. It is difficult for us to, in one sense, realize that if we have men who are our leaders, they are still but men. And so they are sinners. They have sinful desires. They have indwelling sin. And in every way that one man is indeed a sinner and knows what it's like to be a sinner, so our greatest leader is a sinner. But we still must reckon with the fact that one of the things that God has just designed his church to do, but it's also true of nations and particular moments of crisis, that you need a man who can stand and has the kind of talent, the kind of charisma, the kind of gifts that Luther indeed had in spades, that was able to kind of get all of these people behind him. And so Luther was that man up front. And when he dies, there's no one who can do what Luther has done. Melanchthon, despite Luther's desire for him to be his replacement, Melanchthon does not have what it takes. Melanchthon is a scholar. Scholars typically can't do what is required in one sense on this battlefield. I was talking to one of Bo's professors at Reformation Bible College about R.C. Sproul, John MacArthur, and Steve Lawson. And this professor, his last name is Tweedale. He actually was, his father was in the Navy. He was almost born in New Bern, but his father got moved to Norfolk or somewhere in Virginia. And so the next day they went from New Bern to Virginia and his mother gave birth. So he almost got to be a North Carolinian. But Tweedale called MacArthur and Sproul a battleground theologian. I thought that, that does capture those two men. And then I said, do you think Lawson is like that? Do you think that's why Steve Lawson is invited so frequently to preach at Ligonier things? And is that what MacArthur and Sproul see in Lawson, this battleground theologian? It seems to me that there's a kinship between those three, and battleground theologian seems to be maybe a way to describe that. Melanchthon was not one. And so now without Luther, the unity does not exist. They can't hold together. What does that also show us? The Reformation that was taking place, while indeed it was a true Reformation, people were getting saved. The Reformation in Germany was not this spiritual Reformation that united people because all of their hearts had been made new. I think this also illustrates that this was significantly still a political movement, not solely a spiritual one. And so I think that's a helpful lesson. I think that we are able to say, in one sense, yes, we are thankful for the Reformers and for the Protestant Reformation. And we are also able to say there was a lot of politics involved in that Reformation. And I think there's clear evidence that its failures at points illustrate that it was in part political in nature. And so when Luther dies, I think the political nature of this Protestant alliance is manifested, and so it does not hold together. The last element is that Emperor Charles now is given freedom. The opposition on the eastern front of his territory, with the Turks threatening to invade Vienna, it now has been removed, and so Charles V has political freedom to put down the Lutheran heresy, and so he invades and he takes Philip of Hesse, the bigamist. He captured John Frederick, who is Frederick the Wise, that was Luther's prince and protector. He captured Frederick the Wise's son, John Frederick, which means he's captured the princes, at least two of them, in the alliance. In this interim, they come to an agreement called the Augsburg Interim. A document is written by both Catholic and Protestant theologians, and obedience to the interim is required. So what does that mean? If you are demanded to be obedient, what does that show? You lost, All right, you lost. All right, so the Protestants lost, and the Augsburg Interim demanded that they obey this particular order. And so a general council was called. They debated the issues. Charles V's desire is that the reform in Germany would stop, but it was also true that what had taken place in the German people was such that the change you could not go back. And so at some level, Charles V was able to recognize this. Another thing that emerged in the Augsburg Interim was Melanchthon. He was the one who negotiated this, another one called the Leipzig Interim. But Lutherans in Germany distrusted Melanchthon, believing him to be a coward. And so this is the end of Lutheranism. Right? This is, in one sense, when we come to the end of Luther's life, he dies penniless and poor. So his widow had no resources. His children were not given any kind of, substance. And Lutheranism itself is not sort of in this great position of power, and the people distrust its existing leaders. So this is where we come to at the end of Luther's life, and the fall of the Protestant alliance that opposed Roman Catholic Austria and Germany. But this is kind of the story of the first emerging elements of Protestants and Protestantism. So it's not always fireworks and gunshots and a raised flag of victory when we come to history, but it's not over. But any questions? Jerry?
You kind of said it in passing, and before you mentioned the polygamy thing that Luther approved, you said Luther approved the drownings.
No, yeah. So the Anabaptists were a broad group. So some of them were Orthodox. Menno Simons would be one of the Orthodox Anabaptists. Some of them were heretics, Münster kind of prophets, believing in revelations. And so Luther saw all of them as the same. And since they were calling for the baptism, that is believer baptism, the way that they would execute some of them is they would be drowned. And they would drown their families. Well, they were heretics, and so they had a category that the rightful execution of a heretic is, in one sense, that is the job of the state. And so Luther had no problem with the state executing heretics. Calvin is also going to be a part of a particular heretic being executed, but yeah, but Calvin, as we get to it, Calvin is going to encourage the guy to leave, and the guy just refuses to leave. But yeah, there was no love lost for the Anabaptists. John Calvin, however, married the widow of an Anabaptist man, so never to marry again. So that's why Anabaptists were executed by way of drowning. Some of them, not all of them. Yeah, Luther would not think we're Christians. And he surely wouldn't be a member of Berean Community Church. Yes, he is invited to the party.
So was that Luther and Anabaptist initial fellowship up until the point it started falling apart?
Before Münster, I think if we were going to extrapolate some lessons, I think what happens in the Peasant War is there was a debate, there was a discussion that Zwingli and Luther had to see if they could mediate, but they were mediating rather over communion. Zwingli was not an Anabaptist, but Anabaptists did kind of come out from Zwingli and Zwingli's influence. But the Zwickau prophets, as well as Luther's total disdain for any notion of communion with Jesus not being really present, Luther was just against you. So Luther was sort of, he was either with you or against you. It doesn't seem that there was a middle ground for Luther. So I don't know if we could say that he was with Anabaptists at any time. He had a better relationship, or at least he communicated at one point for a while with Zwingli, but that falls apart. But then you have the Peasants War. And I think what takes place is when political unrest begins to now threaten the Lutheran Reformation, Luther seems, this is me, armchair observer of church history, Luther is beginning to assess the Reformation, I think, along the lines of a human political alliance. And this kind of upheaval, Luther knows, is not good. Now, you already have the criticisms from the Catholics saying that this is what Lutheranism does. It creates revolutions and hundreds of thousands of people are executed. So I think Luther seems to at least change his posture a bit and thinks more politically, as opposed to the way that Luther seemed to charge theologically against the whole world in the beginning. At some level, as a man, can you blame him? I think we could empathize with the difficulty. But I think that's what happens. I therefore think that we should be careful, that we should ask ourselves, are we becoming pragmatists or making decisions on the basis of political or relational alliances or advances or stability at the expense of truth? And there generally is tension that the church faces and churches face and individuals face in trying to navigate that. So I think we can have a great deal of charity for Luther, but I think that's what we see taking place and why Luther at the end seemed to not be have the same spiritual moxie as Luther at the Diet of Worms. Yes. Yeah, I just can't, I don't find evidence, but I'm no Lutheran scholar. I mean, I can't find evidence to where he really had compassion for them. Like, well, okay, I guess if you have to drown them. Like, I don't know if it was that big of a deal for him. But I surely haven't read everything. I think we can say Luther was never a revolutionary. I mean, Luther was not after this political kind of revolution. And as we saw in the beginning, Luther didn't start to create this. So that's pretty difficult. You know, if you start something and then it ends up being this, and there's lives that are being lost and there's wars that are being waged, and you're at the center of it all, that's a pretty heavy thing for you to have on your shoulders. So I think that's kind of my judgment of what Luther ended up facing, and that's just not what he wanted. Here's another, this will be my last one. I do think that the way Luther talked kind of creates a bit of this. This is not to say that Luther is responsible for these actions. I think it is to say when we'll take a look at Calvin, we'll see that the way Calvin articulates things, as well as it seems to be a part of his person, which is really in contrast with Luther. I think there is more stability in a leader like Calvin, and there is more volatility in leaders like Luther. God chooses both. So I don't think it's choose this, don't choose that. I think it's just to understand that the Lord uses different leaders at different times for different purposes. But we can also realize that certain approaches to leadership do yield a degree of stability. Other approaches are going to lead to a degree of instability just by the way that they talk and write and address. And I think we see that in Luther, and we're going to see it contrasted with John Calvin. And then we have John Knox, who is my favorite, and he seems to be both embodied. But I'm sure I'm prejudiced. He was a Scot. Any other questions? Nico.
So you're saying this is the like Protestant, outside of like these scenarios, is there anything?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot going on at this time. So we're just focusing. I've chosen to sort of geographically and biographically focus on like Luther in Germany. But yeah, there's stuff going on. So yes. He's over the hill in Zurich. So he's going to be part of the Swiss Reformation, but he's close. Calvin is going to be a little further away. But there's Reformation stuff going on all around. So, and that's the other thing to say is like the Reformation is, it's like it bubbled up. It wasn't like Luther came and sort of struck the fountainhead and then it comes. He clearly is the one who kicked the door down, but at the same time, it's more like it's bubbling up. And so it's emerging in a lot of places, and there's a lot of figures. But we are focusing on the magisterial ones and then Knox, because we're English speakers. If you want to read one book, I think I've said that you should read Here I Stand by Roland Bainton. And that would be the singular book that you should buy and read. Okay, that's Luther. We're leaving Lutherland. And next week we go to Switzerland and look at the Reformation in Geneva and Zurich. So y'all are dismissed. Any questions from Zoom land? All right. Thank you. This is Jay Sutherland who walks in. He's not a vagabond, sort of aimlessly coming in from the street late. If he asks you for money, you